I don't really like doing videos for fighting games that aren't out yet. Don't get me wrong, I'm really excited for SF6, but until there's a lot of gameplay floating around for me to analyze, I don't really have much to comment on besides reporting what's in the game, which you can get instead from just reading a news article or something. Still, I'm getting a lot of requests to say something about SF6, so I'm going to talk about some of the implications for the mechanics we know so far. I'm not going to go over everything we know, and I'm a little shaky myself on some of the details, so bear with me. And before I say anything else, let me say this game looks really good, at least so far. First, here's a screenshot of the UI. There's no visible stun meter, so I wonder if it's hidden or if they just took out Dizzy as a mechanic entirely, which wouldn't bother me as a change. The bottom meter is a super meter specifically now, since EX has been tied to new mechanics. Note that you can now store multiple supers at once, and each character seems to have 3 or so supers available to them at all times, similar to Street Fighter Alpha series. I wouldn't be too surprised if certain characters have routes that contain multiple supers in a single combo. If you've only played SF5, in that game characters have a single super which covers all the bases. For most characters in that game, their super is extremely fast, anti-airs, can be used as invincible reversal, and works in basically all combos. In SF6, I expect those multiple uses to be broken down across the multiple supers, so that maybe one will anti-air, one will go through fireballs, or different combos will use different super enders. Also, every character seems to have a level 3 super that can only be used at max meter, and these level 3s turn into critical arts when your health is low. The critical arts apparently do more damage and have longer, more cinematic animations, which I appreciate a lot from a game design standpoint, since you don't want to be watching a long cinematic all the time. Keeping them just for tense moments is a very welcome and great change compared to SF5 CAs or SF4 Ultras. The 6 blocks below the health are the drive meter. Apparently this starts full every round, so you don't need to try and save it for later. There's 5 mechanics tied to the drive. Seems like they probably could have hit 6 to fit with the theming of the game, but I'll excuse them this time. First is Drive Impact, which costs 1 drive bar, executed by hitting both heavy normals. It's an attack with guard points, so it can go through at least one hit of an opponent's attack, and if it hits you can apparently combo out of it, at least if the opponent's in the corner. This is a bit similar to SF4's focus attack I guess, but a much more obvious comparison I can make is Shatter Strike in KOF 15, which is very similar mechanically. You can probably use this to punish any kind of attack with reactable startup, or just guess with it in neutral, but the fact that it has cost makes it very different from a focus attack, more like red focus. Also, I've heard it loses to certain types of attacks like super, so you'll probably have to be mindful of that too. Next is Drive Parry, done by hitting both mediums. This seems to cost more drive meter the longer you hold it, so maybe it's a bit like Barrier and BlazBlue in that way. If you do parry something, you apparently rebuild some drive meter, and if you parry something just as it hits, you get a perfect parry with a different hit effect and more drive restoration. A lot of people seem to be comparing this to SF3 parries, and I want to say right now that this is a completely different beast. The big thing about SF3 parries is they fundamentally lack very much commitment, while also being very rewarding. This parry is a button press parry, where you're forced into a parrying state, so it's going to be significantly more like Alex's VT1 parries in SF5, especially given that you can keep holding it to keep the parry window going. Parries in SF3 also make almost every attack in the game unsafe, and it remains to be seen how rewarding drive parry will be, or how it can be baited and punished. Even if you just hate parries on principle, this is fundamentally going to be less like SF3 parry or P group parry, and more like SF5 Ryu vs1. One thing to note is you can easily perfect parry distant fireballs, which means there's a universal mechanical answer to long-range fireball zoning, so there's a limit to how turtley you can probably be in this game. Good for people who hate Guile, which seems to be a lot of you. The third mechanic is Overdrive. These are literally just EX moves from previous Street Fighter games, and are performed the same way, the special move motion with multiple punches or kicks. The cost is 2 drive bars, so it could be said that you have a capacity of 3 EX moves. There's nothing much to say about this mechanic, you already know how it works, but note that EX moves into Super should now be possible, unlike SF4 or SF5. Also, you have EX available right at the start of the round, so if you're a character who needs EX to punish fireballs or do reliable anti-airs, you don't need to wait to build some up, so that's nice. Mechanic 4 is Drive Rush. This is executed as a dash, and you can either do it from a parry, which costs 1 drive stock, or a normal, which costs 3. I'm guessing that parry into Drive Rush gives more punish options from a parry, or maybe you can only convert from a parry in the first place if you use Drive Rush, in which this simply provides a cost for converting your read into damage. Meanwhile, the extremely high cost of Drive Rush from normals makes me think there's going to be a significant combo application. Perhaps that you can do something like heavy normal, Drive Rush, then link a medium, etc. This is very similar to FADCs in SF4, albeit much easier to execute I think. It's likely that it can be used to make unsafe normals safe on block, or give you a surprise grab mix-up in neutral or something like that. The fifth and final mechanic is Drive Reversal, towards plus both heavies while blocking, which costs 2 drive bars. This has the same input as a V reversal, and I expect it'll work in a very similar way, spending some meter to end your opponent's pressure. I guess I should also comment on control type. Apparently there's classic controls, which is the default scheme in all Street Fighter games, and modern controls, which offer simplified inputs such as one-button specials. I expect classic will simply be better overall, since they'll have access to more attacks or more mechanics, so this really shouldn't scare anyone who's already used to classic controls. It's just a way for newer players to start playing the game immediately, rather than having to jump through hoops learning inputs, a classic weakness of the fighting game genre as a whole. My first fighting game where I really tried to play to win instead of just mashing was MVC1, which offered a similar easy type control scheme option, and I used it. You could only use 2 of a character's supers in that control scheme, so I remember being really enticed seeing people use the supers I didn't have access to. Now here I am today playing the games properly, so for me at least I think this is a good thing to add and not something players should fear. It's just training wheels, basically. I do admit I'm curious on how one-button specials will work with charge moves, though. The last thing I wanted to mention is World Tour. World Tour already appeared in Console Alpha 3, but now it looks much more like Mortal Kombat Deception's Conquest mode, where you're raising a character like an RPG and probably choosing his attacks or specials or something, while also traveling around talking to NPCs and fighting some of them. Street Fighter titles have been really bad about single-player content, and people adored Alpha 3's World Tour mode, despite how bare bones it was. So this is a really interesting feature, and something Street Fighter desperately needed. I expect this is going to be insanely popular, especially among people who don't normally play fighting games. That's all I've really got to say. I might make some more videos when we see more stuff, but there's really no point to make a video for a character trailer and say, wow, Luke can do his DPs mid-air, when there's nothing for me to analyze. I'll be making videos for SF6 eventually, but I expect only very sparse stuff until the game's actually out.